my honor, thrill, and privilege to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the entire UCR Palm Desert team. We're looking forward to our discussion tonight, our presentation from Dr. Hollis Woodard. I believe, and I could be wrong, but I think this is the third, if not even the fourth time that we've had Dr. Woodard present to us at the Palm Desert Center, and we're just so thrilled that she could be here again in this format. Of course, we had hoped we'd be in person, but this is the next best thing. We are so incredibly grateful to her for her important research and for being so incredibly generous with her time. Speaking of generosity, I want to give a heartfelt thank you to all of our UCR Palm Desert Center partners. I know some of you are tuning in here with us this evening. Thank you so much for your continued support. We could not do what we do virtually or in person without your support. So thank you for helping us to keep our virtual doors open for these events, free, open to all, to enjoy and to learn. Lastly, I want to thank our team here, the Palm Desert Center team. We have Agam Patel, he's our Associate Director. And we have Kelly Irwin, who is our events manager. And of course, our Wild Coachella committee. Thank you so much for all the time, energy, and effort that you put into planning this series. That's Maggie Downs, that's Colin Barros as a volunteer. That's Elizabeth Erickson as a volunteer, and Amy O'Neill, staff member. And also, of course, Dr. Cameron Barros, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes. Also, just a few things about Zoom protocols. Let's use the chat for anything you want to share that isn't a question for our speaker. Otherwise, use the Q&A feature on your screen below, and you can ask any question at any time that will be addressed through Colin Barros to our speaker at the end of her presentation. I think that is it. So glad you're here. And without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague and my friend, Dr. Cameron Barros.
Oops, there we are. There. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. I would have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Woodard. Dr. Woodard received her PhD in biology in 2012 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and next was USDA postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. Since 2015, she has been an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at UC Riverside, where she has a lab focused on bumblebee research and conservation. She's also leading a national initiative to develop a U.S. native bee monitoring network and has broad interest in native bee biology. So Hollis, it is your opportunity to take it away. Thank you.
Okay, let me get my share screen going. Let's see. How does that look for folks? Can you see it? Things look okay.
I can see it looks great.
Okay, thanks. I needed that. Needed that feedback. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to speak to this group. I love hanging out with the Palm Desert crew. I think it is my fourth presentation. I hope I get to do more. Hopefully when this pandemic is finally over, I can come back out to the desert and do this in person. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about a really special group of organisms that live around us here in Southern California. And I'm just going to share some fun facts about them and some of the reasons why they're special, and tell you about some of my favorite desert bees. So I have a lab at UC Riverside in the Department of Entomology. I've been here since 2015, and actually the first graduate student, PhD student, just graduated from my lab this past spring. So think that's a sign that things are going well. If you want to learn more about research in my lab, you can visit our website, and I think the link might pop up at some point during the talk. But you can see more about who works in the lab and what sorts of things we work on. But everything that we do is united around the significance of using bumblebees to study topics like how insects function, how they evolved, how they're persisting in light of global change. So the bumblebees are this main focal group that I work on, that I sort of fell in love with when I was a graduate student, and I have worked with ever since. And I feel like I should give a disclaimer at the beginning of this presentation that most of my work is in the lab. So we keep bumblebees in the lab, and bumblebees are social. They live in a colony, and we study things like how their social interactions operate and how they evolve to be social. So most of my work is in the lab. Most of my work is with bumblebees. And bumblebees, you can find them in many different places, but we tend to find them in these really sort of beautiful alpine and subalpine environments, so not the desert. You can find some bumblebees in the desert, but they're fairly rare there. So a lot of times my research takes me to places like the Sierras, and I've done a little bit of work up in Alaska with wild bumblebees. But I have had a few opportunities to come out to the desert and get excited about desert bees too. And so my interest is definitely peaked. I keep thinking, because it's so close, the deserts around here are so close and easy to get to from Riverside, that I'm probably going to do some projects at some point with our native desert bees, but it hasn't happened that much yet. Mostly it's been coming out and just kind of playing around in the desert and looking for things and learning about things. So I'm going to tell you about some of those exploits and some of the things I've learned. Well, I mentioned that we are in a special place for desert bees. And one of the reasons why I say that is that we are in a bee biodiversity hotspot. So there are about 20,000 species of bee worldwide. And I'm showing you here North and Central and South America. And what you're looking at is a heat map. And you can see the scale on the bottom left. This is a scale of species richness, basically the number of species in a place. And the scale goes from the light yellow, and I apologize if you're colorblind and can't see this because I didn't make this figure, but ranging from yellow all the way over to black. So that's our scale that we're looking at. And the darker the area, the more bee species you find in that area. And what you will notice is that right here, well, all through the desert Southwest really, is the most speciose area within North America. And then we see a lot of bee species in deserts in South America as well. So if I were to show you the rest of this figure, which shows you Eurasia as well, it's the same pattern holds. And so deserts have a lot of bee species relative to other areas. And with more species, you get more diversity in lifestyles and appearances and social behavior, all kinds of fun things. So we're in a place in all of the desert Southwest where there are a ton of bee species. And to get a little bit more specific than a ton, I told you there are 20,000 bee species in the world. There are over 4,000 species in the US, and California is home to 1,600 species. So we have a lot of diversity in the state relative to the country, and we have a lot in Southern California. So we are a special place here and in other deserts around the world. This figure is really sort of showing you the same thing. Here we're just zoomed in even more on the United States. So this is work done by Michael Orr, who also produced the figure in the previous slide, and also by Terry Griswold, another bee biologist who's done quite a bit of work in the Southwest and in many different places. Here too, the scale is richness, so going from a lighter yellow color to black. So the darker the area here too, the more species richness there is. And so you're really seeing the same pattern, but with a little bit more resolution. You can also see some more rainbow colored dots, and those can tell you about how much sampling effort, so how much this group and others have sampled around the US. And we've looked at a lot of more places for native bees, but this is sort of a subset of those data. But nevertheless, the same pattern emerges that in Southern California, especially in the desert areas, we have the most bee species. So why is it that we have so many bee species in deserts? There are many fun hypotheses, but I can give you a pretty quick answer for something that we know is at least part of the story, and that's that we tend to get a lot of floral diversity in deserts, and we tend to see a lot of specialist bees in deserts. So these are bees that visit sometimes only one flowering plant species for their food resources. So we have a lot of specialists and a lot of floral diversity, and you put those two things together and they are interrelated, and you have this sort of hyper biodiverse pattern going on in the deserts. So this is one reason, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that desert bees face that relate to food resources too, but this is sort of a just a very general explanation of one reason why we think deserts are so biodiverse. And so floral diversity in deserts begets bee diversity. And this, I'm cheating a little here. These bees are not all found in deserts, but it is a nice image that shows you a lot of the different sort of shapes and sizes and colors that bees come in. So, and they can get wilder than this. There's some rainbow colored bees down in the neotropics. And there's incredible diversity, but this gives you kind of a flavor of that. I want to talk about one study that I just really like that was done recently in Grand Staircase Escalante. I don't know if any of y'all have been there. I've passed through the southern margin of it, but it's known for these really interesting rock formations. And it's a site where there's been some really extensive bee biodiversity research. So what you're looking at in this figure, which was produced by Olivia Messenger Carroll in 2018. This is the Grand Staircase Escalante region. And what you can see in this figure up in the top left, you can get a sense of where this is relative to things like the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin Desert. What they're showing you in the yellow spots are places where they collected. And also you can think of the orange and the yellow as places where they collected. So you can see this is really extensive sampling within this area. And the study was done over multiple years as well. And one of the things that they found in this study is that in this tiny little, pretty small area of the Southwest, if you count the number of species that they found in this study, which was 660 species, that is nearly as many species as you find in the Eastern US and parts of the Midwest. So that's another sort of gives you a sense of how diverse things are in the Western US and in particular in the deserts. Kind of an interesting comparison to see. So they also sampled across multiple years, and then this group and within Grand Staircase Escalante, and then they also sampled at multiple time points in the year. So one pattern that they observed is that if you look, so this is from ranging on the x-axis of this graph from late April through early October. So if you're sampling through the year repeatedly, and then on the y-axis, you're looking at the number, basically a count of the bees that were collected on the y-axis. You see this interesting pattern where there are two peaks. And this is one of the things about giving a talk on a webinar on Zoom is that I can't engage and ask you and hear what you say about what you think is driving this pattern, but I'll give you a second to take a look at this and think about why we might see these two peaks in this graph. And then I'll also tell you, I'll give you another clue so this is done in parts of places east of here. So in California, we don't see this pattern of these two peaks. So I'll give you 1 second to guess, and then I'll tell you. Farther east, there's a second sort of wave of rains that comes, the monsoon season. And so in this region where this study was done, you get this spring bloom, and then you'll get this secondary sort of late summer bloom that happens. And just like the bees have this sort of pattern, you see this with flowers as well. And so here in California, you tend to get one peak where you have this one bloom period that happens. And in the deserts, it happens pretty early. So roughly coinciding with this peak of flowers in Grand Staircase Escalante. So that's just kind of an interesting thing that happens and further supports the idea that flowers are a key driver of bee diversity and abundance in this case. So, and just to remind everyone, bees are using flowers as a food resource. They are drinking nectar from the flowers, and they are consuming pollen from the flowers as well. And bees are collecting some of that pollen. They depending on the species, they might be consuming some of the pollen from the flower, but female bees that are nesting are often collecting those pollen resources and bringing them back to a nest and leaving them in the nest for their offspring. And I have some photos of that coming up soon. And just to give you a taste of something closer to home, Michael Orr, who did some of the work that I mentioned a few slides ago, also did some pretty extensive sampling in Joshua Tree and found the same pattern of hyperdiversity and estimated that there were between 500 to 650 species. I would guess there are even more. There's a lot that remains to be found in the deserts out here. So we see the same pattern going on out here closer to home. Now, I want to go ahead and head something off now and bring it up because it's an important topic in bee research, and it's something that bears mentioning. When I talk about bees, so I talked about the bumblebees that I work on, and then I talked about the native desert dwelling bees. And I'm going to talk a lot more about them. When I'm talking about these bees, I'm talking about native bee species. These are bees that are here. They evolved here. They were here in most cases long before humans arrived. So I want to contrast that with the European Western honeybee, Apis mellifera. So this is a bee that was brought to the United States for honey production, and now is used primarily, and now is used intensively for crop pollination. I know folks probably know about these bees. So they are the ones that are kept in hives that look like this. And I have this figure because I always get asked about them. And I think especially when I come give talks out here, because or when I give talks out in the desert, because when people have swimming pools and places that are really hot and dry, you will get honeybees that end up in the pool. And so this is a sort of symbol or an image of that situation happening. And so these honeybees are unlike a lot of the native bees in that they can actually collect water and bring it back to the nest. And they regurgitate the water on the nest and they fan their wings. And they do that to sort of make a little air conditioning system in their nests. And so I get asked about honeybees all the time. They are not native. They are here, I think, probably for good. They are important for crop pollination. People put these hives out and use them for pollinating crops, but they are not native. And there is accumulating evidence that they are, that slide didn't play. Here we go. There is accumulating evidence that they are actually interacting in some harmful ways with our native bee species in some contexts. So here's a bumblebee on the right and a honeybee over on the left. I don't know what they're doing, but they're hanging out really close. So we know now that in some cases, in some studies, we see that honeybees can spread diseases to the native bees. And they can also, they do remove a lot of food resources, a lot of pollen and nectar from environments that native bees in some cases are likely very dependent on. And so there's this sort of heating issue going on with native bees and the honeybee. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the questions, because I think this is it's an important thing to talk about and to think about. And I know a lot of folks are curious about it as well. So I want to talk about a few of my favorite things I see in the desert, and some of the bees that are associated with them, and just some of the patterns, and show you some photos of some cute bees and just talk about them a little bit. So Creosote Bush, iconic desert plant. There's a pattern with creosote that you can see in this figure. So what you're seeing here is these are places where you find creosote, essentially, where you see these little pie charts. And the places in black are the proportion of years when this Laria tridentata, which is the creosote bush, bloomed in spring. And so you can see bloomed only, so black is spring and later in the season. And white is it bloomed, did not bloom in the spring. Yes. Okay. So what happens out here in the Southwest and Southern California is that you have a lot of years where creosote doesn't bloom. That happens when there's not enough precipitation in the fall or primarily in the winter. And we're seeing that more and more. So I'd be curious if you were to remake this graph how that would look now sort of through time. But when we have dry years, primarily in the winter prior to the bloom period, some things just don't bloom. And so any bees that are dependent on creosote as a food resource, and there are some species, some bee species that specialize on it, when they are not able to get their food resource, things can start to go awry for them. And there are some special strategies bees have that allows them to deal with this that I'm going to talk about in a second. But this is a problem for desert bees that they do have some sort of solutions for, but I think it's going to be a worsening problem. And I'm going to talk about that a tiny bit at the end of the talk, how climate change is impacting some of these processes. So this is the main strategy, is that some bees are able to bide their time during these years when there aren't enough flowers. So if there was not enough rainfall, typically the winter before the spring bloom period, some bees can just sort of hang out underground or wherever they're nesting and skip a year, and even skip multiple years. There's some reports that some bee species can even skip 10 years. And I'm going to explain what I mean now when I say skip. So this is a really generic plot that shows you the bee life cycle. So we've got it running from March until October and then through February. So we've got the whole year here. And when we talk about bees, there are male bees and there are female bees. And then within the nest, there are larvae, which are little grub-like young bees. And then some bees all bees pass through a stage 2 where they pupate and then they eclose. And so you can think of these as like really young offspring and then slightly older offspring. So males will emerge in the spring and they'll start flying around. You can see them and they have some characteristics that are different from female bees. So you can usually tell the difference between them. Females will also come out in the spring and they will fly around and visit flowers. When they do that, they're often getting pollen on them and they're transferring it between flowers. And so that's why we say they're pollinating. And they're also laying eggs. So these adult female bees that have emerged, they come out, they fly around, they develop their ovaries and they find a nest site and they lay eggs in their nest. Those eggs, now we're switching to our young bee stages, those eggs will develop into larvae. And so now we're switching down here to the larval row. So the larvae will develop and they can do this interesting thing, some bees, where they can essentially hold in a pattern. They can either stay a larva and they can stay fixed in that developmental stage, sometimes for multiple years, or they can go ahead and turn into a pupa and they can stay in a pupal stage for multiple years. And so this is a strategy that bees can have. We don't totally know how they do it. They're not thinking that things are probably not great. They should probably stay inside. They're probably getting humidity cues, and there is a little bit of evidence that that's what's happening, and it kind of makes sense. You need rain to produce flowers, so that would be a good signal to try to detect, to try to time whether you emerge or not. But it's this strategy of not finishing your development and coming out and nesting the following spring, instead of just staying in that fixed developmental pattern that we think allows bees in deserts to persist despite these high interannual differences in rainfall. So it's kind of an interesting, fun thing about bees that's still a little bit of a mystery at this point in terms of how they do it. I mentioned that there are lots of different specialists. This is Indigo Bush, one of my favorite plants to look for in the desert. There are specialists on this. This is the bee that I featured in the first slide of my presentation. So there are specialists. This is a specialist on this plant. Bees that are specialists, they often associate closely with their host plant. By that, I mean they often nest not too far from it. If you want to find the bee, you go find the host plant and sit, sometimes for a really long time, but then you can usually see them show up. So it's this kind of fun way that if you want to work on or just see a really rare bee in the desert, and it has a pretty close association with the host plant, you can go to the plant when it's blooming, at least, and you can look for it and you can often see it show up. So it's kind of a fun thing. Some animals, you can't do that. You have to kind of wander around and try to find them, and there's nothing sort of identifiable in the landscape that can allow you to hone in on them. But with these specialist bees, we have that opportunity, which is kind of neat. Here's a classic plant, Strelsia, globe mallow, iconic desert plant. I love this one, and there are specialists on this plant too. So if you grow Strelsia, you might see this bee showing up. This is a bee. I'm going to talk about this group later, but this genus is generally known as the Cactus Bees. But you can see them. And another thing about specialist bees is that you can often look for the flowering plants that they like when they're blooming, and you can often look in the flowers and you can find them in there. And some bees, depending on the bee and the flower, they'll actually spend quite a bit of time just sort of hanging out, not clearly actively collecting pollen within flowers. So that's a thing that you can do. If you see these things blooming in the desert, you can kind of go over, and these solitary desert bees are extremely unlikely to sting you. I mean, everything has a breaking point, I guess, but they're very unlikely to. So you can go up to them and, give them some space, but you can kind of open the flower a little bit and look for them. And they're often very docile and not interested in, they're not in their home. They're not in a defensive mode. Usually they're just on a flower and spending time there, and you can get a kind of close look at them. So that's something kind of fun to do. Most bees in the desert and in many other places, they nest in the ground. Here's a little bee that's peeking out of a nest in the ground. This isn't the only strategy they use, but this is a pretty big one. I've had the pleasure of trying to dig up desert bee nests. This is me doing my best to excavate a nest of a species out in Arizona. It's hard work, despite how little they are. Their nest chambers can be quite deep underground. So you have to kind of try to follow the nest when you're digging it out. One trick is that you can use, I think it's plaster of Paris, this powder, and you can kind of put it into the nest hole, and then you get a little trowel or knife and sort of scrape around it, and then you put a little more powder and you just keep going and you follow the nest, and you can see the nest structure. Some bee species have pretty complicated nesting structures. Others just have a linear sort of cavity in the grounds, but it can get complicated and they can go really far underground. But this is a lot of fun if you see a bee to try to get into its nest. This is me. I think I successfully found one larva from a nest, so I was very proud of that. It's hard work, but there's me sort of victorious, having collected a single larva from a bee nest. Bees also nest in crevices and places. So this is out at Boyd Deep Canyon. Actually, my friend Sarah saw a bee fly into a crevice in a rock, and it was nesting in there. And so we were putting a tube onto the rock and kind of waiting until the bee flew out so that we could see what species it was. So they do that strategy. And then they'll also nest in sticks and twigs, and they'll nest in agave stems, a few different bee species. So this is Crystal Watrous, who worked in my lab and still works at UCR. Fantastic melittologist, that's a bee biologist. Here she is having hacked down an agave stem trying to find a bee nest, and I think we did find it, and that's why she's smiling. But they can nest in all kinds of places in the desert. They sort of make their home in different sort of situations, and this is one reason why, for people that manage more sort of manicured lawns and things, we often recommend that you leave some brush and some debris and don't just clear everything, because those twigs that have fallen down and the stems of things, bees nest in those things, and bees need them for their nesting habitat. So it's good to leave some things around and give them some space to live. Okay, here are a few of my favorite bee species or bee groups. This is the genus Centris. This is a really beautiful group of bees. Some of them, this group is it's known for its diversity in eye color, among other things, but you can find species that have red eyes and yellow eyes and green eyes. This is a species, I think in the next figure I have, this is a group of bees that reached some internet fame when a photo was taken of a bee in this broader group collecting tears from a turtle in I think it's in South America. So it became a little internet celeb for a little while. This is a bee that's probably excavating a nest. So their common name is the digger bee, and that's because they dig in the ground, and they're kind of large bodied, and so you can see them. So if you walk around deserts, they often nest in more compacted soil, including trails and other sort of throughways that people walk on a lot. You can see them, and you can see them excavating and sort of digging the nest out. So they're pretty industrious little bees. This is a bee that we don't actually find it this far west, as far as I know. This is the pale citrus bee, and it's just gorgeous. So I figured I'd show it. But this is one of the more beautiful, I think, members of this bee genus, Centris. And some species of Centris have a really interesting habit or way of life where they will collect oil from specialized tissues on some plants. So this is Cremeria, and it has some special structures on the flower that when scraped, and these bees actually have a specialized structure on the leg that they use for scraping the floral tissue. There's an oil that's secreted. The bees collect the oil, and then they actually bring the oil back to their nest, and their larvae develop on that. And so they're also consuming some pollen and nectar like a normal bee would do, but they also eat this really high fat, high lipid diet. And this, most bees eat pollen and nectar. That's just a thing that folks know, but there are a few bees that have some different feeding strategies, and this is one example. And so if you see Cremeria blooming out here, you can look for these bees, and they don't show up that often. I can tell you that from looking for them quite a bit, but you can see them show up, and you can see them manipulating the flowers and collecting the oil. So it's pretty neat. There are other bees that are oil collecting, but this is a system, this Cremeria and these citrus bees, some of the citrus species that do this nearby. So this is a local oil collecting bee. Just as a fun fact, there are also some bees that eat carrion that in the tropics. So, not all bees are just floating around visiting flowers and doing things with flowers. They actually visit rotting meat. Kind of fun to think about. Oh, I'm just showing you here a photo of, this is a larva. On the left, this is an egg on a pollen mass. And this pollen is pretty soupy. And I believe I pulled this because this is a photo of an oil collecting bee provision. And so it's orangey because there's pollen in there too. And there's nectar, but there's also this oil. And so the egg hatches into a larva, continues to develop. And eventually, if it's alive, it will become a pupa and then emerge as an adult. So just so you can see some of the developmental stages a little bit more close up. These are some squash bees, the genus Peponapus. I guess this has been changed recently, but I like that name, so I'm going to keep calling them that for a while until I get corrected enough. So these are bees that you find within squash flowers. I've seen them in my yard. These are some bees that, of all the bees and floral associations that you can observe, you can often find these bees within squash. They often will spend the night sleeping in the flowers, and you can find them. So I could probably walk outside and find some right now, maybe, but they're very closely associated, and they seem to have a high affinity for the flowers and spend a lot of time in them. So you can find them if you have cucurbit flowers. You can look around and find them in the landscapes. These bees have this really special history that you can see in this figure. This is work by Margarita Lopez Uribe from 2016, where she looked at the migration or the movement of these bees. So that I told you they're associated with squash. And in the orange here, you can see the range of cucurbit species. And you can see the red dots are sampled sites. And the green is this Peponapus pruinosa, this squash bee species. And based on the patterns of genetic diversity of the bees collected in these sites and our understanding of where the squash is found and where the bees are found today, it looks like what happened is as humans moved these squash across the modern day United States, the bee moved with them. And so humans essentially facilitated the movement of these squash bees. And today you can find them up in the Northeast. You can find them in a pretty wide range of places. It's kind of a fun story that integrates human movement and anthropology with bees and agriculture. So it's a really fun story, and I recommend checking out this paper if you're interested in learning more about that. Here's a bee that you don't find around here, unfortunately, but it's still just one of the coolest stories. There are so-called Sandstone Bees, Anthophyra Pueblo. This is a species that received its epithet from the Puebloan people who built homes in the Southwest on cliffs and mesas. So this bee actually excavates sandstone with its mandibles and nests in the sandstone. So these are holes, nest holes of this bee. And we think it needs water to help facilitate that process. And you can see that when the bees are older and they've been nesting for a while, the mandibles are really worn down. It's because they're doing this really extraordinary architectural task that allows them to, it seems like, have a protected home in a place that's really dry and fairly harsh, probably from a bee's perspective. And so it's a really neat study system. And I think I have a little video here if it'll play. I'll try to see if it'll work. Where you can see a bee. I think you just see it fly out of the hole. This is to prove to you that a bee is associated with this. I think it flies out. There it goes. So these sandstone bees are found in parts of Arizona and parts of the desert east of here. I think I have the distribution. Yeah, here's some places where they've been located. And so you can go to sandstone sort of cliff faces and look for these little holes, and they're actually pretty distinctive. So that's I'd say that's one of the most interesting bees. There are also bees that nest in the rims of volcanoes. There are bees that line their nest cavities with flower petals. There are the bees that eat carrion. There are all kinds of interesting things out there in the world, but these are just a few of the ones that you find here. I'm sure you've all seen the Carpenter bees, genus Xylocopa. These are large-bodied bees that I often get told from someone that they saw a bumblebee. It's usually, if they're in the desert, it's these Carpenter bees instead. One way you can tell the difference is they have this, bumblebees are very like fuzzy, whereas these Carpenter bees, they tend to be more shiny and have this sort of iridescent look. So that's one way to tell them apart. They visit Palo Verde trees, one of the iconic desert trees around here and in the Southwest. And so when these are blooming, you can find the Carpenter bees. I see them in my front yard. I guess I don't see them anymore this time of year, but I'll see them through the spring when they usually start nesting through pretty late summer. You can see them flying around and visiting, especially this tree, but they visit other things too. Just gorgeous. This is a species, the Valley Carpenter Bees, Xylocopa sonorina, that the males are this orange color. They're kind of like these big teddy bear looking things, and the females are more darkly colored. And this is just another iconic bee that I actually had not seen this bee in Riverside until this year. I saw it on the Palo Verde tree in my front yard. So I was very excited about that. So I'm hoping to see more of them in subsequent years. Carpenter bees in general get a little bit of a bad rap because they do nest often, many of them in wood, including in the eastern US in man-made structures, people-made structures. And so they can excavate the wood, and they don't do a lot of structural damage, but they are considered pests in some places. Out here in the deserts, they're mostly nesting in agave stems. So this is an agave stem that we cut down and sort of chopped into and found the larvae. You can see some of the frass. You can see this is really interesting. They take the wood that they've chewed through and they sort of turn it into a pulpy little plug that separates the different larval chambers. So it's kind of a fun reuse of sawdust. I mentioned these earlier, the cactus bees. These are the genus Diadasia. Not all of the Diadasia spend a lot of time with cacti, but some of them are really strongly, have the strong affinity and close association with cactus. So this is another plant, kind of like the squash and the squash bees. If cacti are flowering, you can go out and look in the flowers, and you'll often find that there are cactus bees sort of cuddled up inside of them. So that's a fun thing to look for as well. And the Diadasia build these little turrets. You can find these. So if you're walking again usually on compacted soil out in the deserts, you can find these little kind of tubes sticking up. And this is often it's these diadasia nesting. I'm going to flip through a little bit quickly my last few bees because just in the interest of time, but on the Anthophyra, so Anthophyra Pueblo is one species within this genus that I mentioned, the Sandstone Bee, but Anthophyra means flower-footed. These bees are very zippy and fast, so they're a little hard to see until they land on a flower, but these are a gorgeous group of bees that are not just found in deserts, but they tend to be more diverse in the deserts. And they also can build these little kind of turret looking things that stick out of the ground or the substrate that they're nesting in. So they're kind of a characteristic thing that you might not see the bee, but you might be walking and you might come across these little structures on the ground. And I had to sneak in a bumblebee just because this is a bee. I've never seen it in the deserts in Southern California. I've seen it along the coast. So if anyone sees one of these, please take a photo immediately and send it to me because I'd love to see if they're out here. They are in the low desert farther east of here, but I've never seen one here again, except on the coast. But they're pretty characteristic. They have this pretty bright yellow coloration. They're mostly yellow coloration. Again, you can find them further east. There's this gap in the southeastern California where you don't tend to find them, but you never know. So keep an eye out for them. And I just wanted to mention, I told you some of the interesting adaptations that bees have to living in deserts, this thing that they can do, some species where they can sort of hang out and arrest their development for a little while and not emerge in a given year and emerge instead in a better later year. And I talked about their dependence on flowers, and one of the things that's definitely going on, but we don't really know that much yet how it's all going to play out, is that climate change is probably impacting our desert bee populations. And so this is a map that I liked from online forum or something called GRIST, and it showed, they basically took the information from the National Climate Assessment that happened in 2018, and they made this map of the US that shows what are sort of the worst challenges that region is going to have to deal with. And a surprise to no one that lives here, in the Southwest, we're predicted to get hotter and drier faster than anywhere else. And we are already the hottest and driest part of the US. And so this is the challenge that desert bees face when it comes to climate change. As it gets drier, there are going to be fewer flowers. The sandstone bee, if it depends on water to excavate its nests and it doesn't have that anymore, there are many different processes that are going to be impacted. And it's an interesting question from a scientific perspective. If deserts have been really great for sort of developing bee biodiversity, and they've evolved these unique strategies to deal with the desert, certainly there's a limit to that. And at some point we're going to be going past that limit. We probably already are for some species, and we just don't have enough information about that yet. So I did want to at least mention that, and mention that this amazing resource that we have here, it's not just a resource, these amazing bees, they're beautiful. And this is a threat that they're facing that is definitely going to have some devastating impacts on their populations. And I don't want to close on a negative note. So instead I'll close on a more positive note. That I want to tell you about two things. One is that the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation, they do invertebrate conservation work all over the US and beyond. They have had several Bumblebee Atlas projects. These are run for a given state. Other states have been tackled, but not California yet. But in the spring of next year, they are launching a California Bumblebee Atlas project. So this is a chance for people to get outside, learn how to identify bumblebees, look for them. You can find bumblebees in the eastern part of the county. So I said you don't see them in the low desert, but if you go up to higher elevations, you can find them. So this project is going to be looking for volunteers who are interested in spending some time getting to know the bumblebees and looking for them. And I know they're going to want people in the southeastern part of the state because we just have some interesting things going on in our area. So if you're interested in this, I have some information, and these links can be shared too. definitely consider getting involved in this. The project so far in other states have been really successful. They've yielded some important insights about bumblebees. It's all non-lethal, so it's going out, you do handle them a little, but it's taking a photo and then letting them go on their way. And so it's a great thing to do with kids. So I definitely recommend checking it out. And they have a website, but it's officially launching next spring. And then I also want to mention this. There's a lot of text on this slide, so I'm not expecting you to actually read this text, although I can share the slide with folks. Our department has started a special scholarship to make entomology more inclusive. And what that means is we're raising money so that we can give students paid research opportunities to work in our department. These are specifically trying to support students who face barriers of all kinds to doing research. So many of our students at UCR, for example, have to work jobs on top of being a full-time student. They do a lot. And so that situation can prevent them from being able to do research with us. And we want them to do research with us because it's fun and we want to support their careers. So we've already awarded our first one of these scholarships to a student, and we're so excited to give more of these. There's a special thing happening as of October 4th where donations are going to be matched through a special program, and there's more information in this slide. So if you're interested in donating to the scholarship, we would really love to have any support, and this goes to the students. So it is all going into their pockets to help support them so that they can do research with us and learn about insects and have fun and advance their careers. So just wanted to mention that to everyone. I should give my email too. Maybe I'll type that in the chat at the end of the talk, and you can always email me as well. So I hope I haven't gone too far over. I think I'm actually weirdly perfect on time, but it's unusual. But thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about any of the bee related or other topics that I mentioned.
Great. Thank you, Hollis, and thank you all for listening and sharing, sharing your knowledge with us. So folks, if you have questions, we have a good number of questions already in the Q&A, but continue to add them as we go, and I'll do my best to pass them along. Let's start right. So we do have as you predicted, we have a fair number of questions about European honeybees. Maybe let's get a couple of those out of the way.
Sure.
So a simple one, I guess they're called European honeybees, but where are they from originally? How did they get here? I guess kind of easy stuff.
The current thinking on where honeybees originally evolved is Southeast Asia, and they're found today, they're native to all parts of Eurasia and Northern Africa. So they've been brought to the US multiple times from multiple of those places at this point. So, but they're more of an old world species.
And maybe sort of related, if people, first question about removing bees, you mentioned some bees that are considered to be pests. Maybe talk about some of the alternatives maybe to removing bees that might be considered to be a pest, but not really.
Well, let's see. When it comes to honeybees, there's an interesting thing going on that there are many feral populations of honeybees. So we meaning humans, not me, but we keep them in hives, but they can actually leave the hive and create a new hive. And so out in the deserts, I've seen many, many, many honeybees that I would bet money are feral. They're not living in a managed hive at that point. They're living somewhere in a cavity. There's one actually in my neighborhood that we walk by and we're like, oh, they're still there. It's a feral hive. So there are companies that can remove these feral honeybees, and I actually support the removal of feral honeybees from housing structures or any place, because as I said, everything's a trade-off. I don't want any bee to ever not exist, but there's a place for them, and there are places where they're actually harming other bees. And so it's good to read more about beekeeping and it's fun. I've kept some honeybees in grad school. It is fun, and they're really interesting. They have really interesting behavior, but there are some costs to keeping them. And so it's good to kind of inform yourself about those costs. and potentially consider removing them. When it comes to any other bee, I'm anti-removal. I think they should just stay where they are. So I bought a house in Illinois when I was in grad school, and I was about to sign the paperwork and I was all excited. My realtor called me and said, okay, we're all set. And don't worry, we've sprayed, or we're going to spray the awning underneath the house to get rid of those Carpenter bees that were under there. And I was like, no, let them stay. They don't do that much damage. So those are my personal thoughts. They don't do a lot of damage. They don't do a lot of harm. They're unlikely to sting you, the native bees. So why not let them hang out and have a life, wherever they are trying to nest.
So if someone's not sure if they have a native bee or a introduced bee, is there a kind of like easy, quick way to tell, or a resource that they can go to maybe?
Yeah, just Google honeybee. And if it's not a honeybee, it's almost certainly a native bee. There are a few little exceptions, but in general, so the honeybees, when I first started learning my bees, I would see them and I think, okay, they look pretty similar to a lot of other bees. But the more you look at them, the more you sort of gain that sense, that ability to tell the difference between them. So, so you can definitely Google pictures, but you can also email me. I get people emailing me and telling me I found this cool bee. What is it? And sometimes I know, sometimes I can't tell from the photo, but I can usually tell you if it's a honeybee or not.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question about, and I am also very interested in this process where desert bees are arresting their development for long periods of time. So you mentioned that can last up to 10 years. Can you talk a little bit more about how are they doing that?
Yeah, there are a few studies, and I can email them to you if you're interested, but there's a study that actually excavated out some ground near where some known nests were. And in the experiment, they manipulated the humidity and it caused some of the bees to emerge, which is a piece of evidence that supports that humidity is at least one of the cues that allows them, that's triggering them to emerge or not.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, we know a lot from, surprisingly not bees, but flies, from fruit flies, which are a really well-studied model system. We've learned a lot in fruit flies about how development is regulated. And interestingly, bees have a lot of that same sort of machinery. So we think that when it comes to the processes that are going on within the bee, there are actually some things that are pretty similar to fruit flies. So we know a little bit about some of the genes, the parts of the genome that are involved in that. But truly, everything I just said is pretty much the main stuff we know. So other than that, it's a mystery. As you can imagine, it's this hard thing to study because it takes multiple years to study the phenomenon out in the wild. And so it's the experiment with the humidity. I was like, wow, it was a great idea because I can't think of a single other way to try to tackle that, really.
Right. I mean, you'd imagine they have to have some mechanism to keep from drying out, and there's all kinds of stuff that must be going on, right?
Yeah. Yep. There are there's some interesting things with bees and diapause, which is the state of arrested development that they enter. We call it diapause. There are some other interesting things known about not desert bees and this extended arrest, but just that basic process and how it operates in bees. That research might lead to a better understanding of how the desert bees are doing this specific thing. But yeah, so far we still just don't really know the details of it, which is kind of fun to think about.
Okay, so we have a question about some of the different ways that bees collect and transfer pollen, and if there are maybe variations between species that you could talk about.
Yeah, well, so the bumblebees and the honeybees too, and some of the other social bees, they have this structure on their legs, the pollen basket, the corbicula, and they'll pack pollen into this little structure and they'll carry it back to the nest. And the reason we think they evolved this special structure is that they are the bees that when they go back to their nest, they have often a giant nest with tons of offspring in the nest. They do this thing called progressive feeding that I actually study in my lab with bumblebees, where rather than just collecting some pollen, laying an egg on it, closing it off, and that's their cell, which is what a lot of the solitary bees do. The bumblebees instead, and the honeybees and some other social bees, they actually interact directly with their larvae and feed them, and they do this regurgitation behavior. That has become something we work on a lot in my group. So it's this interesting example of how they have a morphological adaptation that's related to their social biology that also relates to their pollination sort of behaviors and things like that. But bees in general, if you look across the solitary bees, they tend to have places on the body where they have more brushy hairs. And depending on the bee group, it can be in some slightly different places. So some of the bees have more brushy hairs sort of underneath the abdomen, and that's when they're visiting flowers, more of the pollen's getting deposited there and moved between flowers that way. Some of them have not a corbicula, like this basket structure. Instead, it's just dense brushy hairs on the leg. So they're transporting more on the leg. So there's actually quite a bit of variation among bees in terms of where pollen goes on the bee and how they move it between flowers.
Right, and there's some bees that are like skipping the whole pollen process and just stealing nectar directly and that kind of thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a student that works on that. It's called Nectar Robbing, and honeybees do it. Carpenter bees definitely do it, where some of the flowers that are more sort of conical shaped, you can see some little holes at the base of the flower, which is where the nectar is. Some of the bees, they just bypass the pollination altogether, and they'll instead cut a hole in the flower, get the nectar, and they don't come in contact with the reproductive parts of the flower. So that's an example, we would say, of cheating in an evolutionary sense, where the bees are getting the reward without doing the work of pollination.
Let's see. There a couple more questions about sort of bee identification. People who have bees in their yard and they want to know what they are, or they see a bee nest and they want to know what it is. Do you have a recommended resource? Is there like a field guide to bees that's worth using, or a website, bug guide kind of a thing? Or
yeah, this is not exactly that, but I have a couple books on my bookshelf right here. And then I have a few more I can recommend. There are some books about what you can plant to feed the bees. And within these books, they have some information for what to plant actually around here or in the deserts. There are a few different books. I can type them in the chat. They're some of my favorite books for learning to identify bees. There's a book called Bees in Your Backyard. That's amazing. It has a ton of photos, ton of cool maps and bees on flowers. So that book, it was actually co-written by the woman that did the study in Grand Staircase Escalante. I highly recommend that book for anyone that's, even if you're not super a bee biologist, it's just fun to open up and look around. And so that's definitely one I'd recommend.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question about you. One of the slides, I think in particular, there was a group of bees that had very different colored eyes. And we had a question about what the reason for that is.
I don't think we know that. I don't think we know. Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, I could speculate, but you can find bees. They're in the same group of bees. You can find them in the same place with different colored eyes. So there's not something. Yeah, I don't think we know that.
So maybe related to that, like, what are the kind of big unanswered questions you feel like that at least your lab is focused on right now? Or can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I would say we in my lab, we tend to look in two directions. We tend to look back and ask, how did bumblebees evolve to be the way that they are today? Most things aren't social in the world. Most animals, most insects, they live a solitary life. And there are these specific lineages of bees that have evolved to live socially. And when you live in a social colony, if you're a bee, there's the queen, and she's the primary reproductive among females. And then there are the workers, and they are almost entirely sterile. And so you have a system that somehow evolved. And we have some theoretical understanding of how it happened that we think is accurate, but it's interesting to think that you could evolve a system where some individuals do not do the main thing that organisms are supposed to do, which is reproduce. And so how do you make a system like that? Like literally, how does it evolve? How does it operate? So we're often asking a lot of questions like that, where we're actually trying to look back into the past and try to infer how things became how they are today. And then I'm becoming increasingly interested in looking ahead to the present and future, given how incredible they are and this lifestyle that they live, the bumblebees. How are they going to fare in light of climate change and other anthropogenic changes? And so we have some evidence now that the answer is they're in trouble. A quarter of bumblebee species are threatened. They face extinction. And a lot of bumblebee species we actually don't know, so we just don't have enough data. There are some interesting patterns. Cameron and I actually talked about this yesterday, where bumblebees in some places look like they're moving up to higher elevations. So it's becoming too hot, dry, not enough flowers at lower elevations. And so they're moving up. And so what happens when they move up? Do they displace other species? There's a limit to how far up you can go on a mountain. So what happens when they reach that limit? So there are these questions that have become increasingly pressing, I'd say, in my life over the last 10 years or so, about how they're going to possibly persist if things keep changing. So we're looking in those two directions, and depending on the researcher and what they're interested in, they do sort of look in one of the two directions, and a few of us are looking in both and trying to figure out both things and even how they intersect together.
Great. That brings your last point there about bees moving up the mountain, brings up a question to me about, if for those bees that are specialists, are the things that they're specializing going to move at the same rate, even if they can move up the mountain?
Yeah, it's a really cool thing. If you specialize on something, you and that thing can co-evolve, so that maybe if you're a bee, you're very efficient at accessing that flower. Maybe so you can handle the flower really well. You can find it in the landscape really well because you're very attuned to it. You've evolved to have those capabilities. So if thinking about the past, the evolutionary history of these bees, specialization is a really cool thing, but it also potentially locks you in. So you are dependent on the partner in that association. And if something happens to the plant, then the bee is in trouble unless they can switch to something else. And so this is a growing concern. And it's particularly a concern for the desert bees because so many of them are specialists, although you find specialist bees in other places too. But that a lot of the bees in our deserts, if they're the plants that they depend on, if they go away, the bees either have to possess the ability to switch or they will go away too. And there are a few case studies where people are starting to see evidence that this is happening. And the bumblebees, they tend to be generalists, so they can switch to other things. So they might, in that sense, you might think they would do better than some specialist bees, but they're also more sensitive to high temperatures. So they're not okay in that sense. So, but yeah, that's one of the big questions about specialist bees and their future. And it's completely linked to the future of the plants that they depend on.
Could you talk a little bit more about, there's a question about the cacti bees that you mentioned, or cactus bees. So what is it about the cactus, or what is it about the bees, or both, that makes those two things specialize with each other? Do we know?
I don't know that we know that much about that specific association. Other than that, the cacti, presumably the pollen might be particularly nutritious for this group of bees. You might assume that would be the case, but there haven't been there's some great studies on the natural history of the cactus bee. So there's been a lot of work on that, but in terms of the details of that association, like the chemical ecology and the nutritional ecology, something we work on with the bumblebees, as far as I know, we don't know anything yet about those associations. So there are a ton of things that we don't know about these desert bee species that hopefully students in my lab and other labs in our department will become increasingly interested in them and try to figure some of these things out.
Let's see. So you talked a little bit about some of the resources for the plants, the book, there was a couple of good books I think you recommended for things to plant. We had some questions about bee houses or creating habitat besides, leaving maybe some leaf litter, twigs or old branches and things like that in the yard. What about like constructed habitat for bees? Do you recommend any of those?
So the best bee house is a natural bee house. So you leave vegetation for them. But some species of bee do really seem to go to those bee houses, which have been increasingly, you can find them now at like Home Depot.
Home Depot has them, yeah.
Yeah, and you can look online and find how to make your own. They're actually pretty easy to make. You have to use certain types of wood and you have to get the right diameters of the cavity. But I'd say the jury's out on those. So they in many places you can put them out and you just don't get anything. So I think sometimes they can be a letdown for people who put them out and are like really excited. And then they're kind of like, okay, it's summer, where are the bees? And it just might not be the right bee house for the bees in that place. But in other places you can put them out and you get a ton of bees. And sometimes you get this interesting situation where you don't get bees, you might get spiders or parasitic wasps or other things that might visit these. Which is not, they're great too. So that's fun. But yeah, so they can be hit or miss, I would say. And I always would recommend instead to encourage natural habitat because the bees are really savvy about where they want to nest and they go where they want to go. And nothing beats just leaving some place, wild, and it's a lot easier and cheaper and more sustainable. So that's always the best strategy.
Let's see. So a question about the colony collapse disorder and whether that affects native bees at all, or maybe the same factors are affecting native bees.
Colony collapse is this interesting phenomenon that first came on people's radars when I was in graduate school. And my understanding of it, so it's a thing that happens with honeybees, and it does appear to be its own distinct disorder. Like some pretty characteristic things happen when a colony has colony collapse disorder. There's nothing like it that we see in any of the other bee species that have been studied. So if you read up on colony collapse, there are some different opinions about it. Was it even real? How much of what happened to honeybees and continues to happen to them, how much of it is this strange disorder and how much of it is just that we are relying on them too much for too many things and we're stressing them out and we're losing a lot of colonies just because we're asking too much of them. By asking too much, I mean we put them on trucks and move them around the United States. We put them in places that are really hot and dry where they wouldn't sort of normally be found. We spray our agroecosystems with chemicals that are harmful to bees. So we're doing a lot of things that are very obviously harming honeybees. And so in some cases, colony collapse disorder seems like it gets invoked to be this sort of thing when really there's some much more obvious explanations that might be explaining the patterns. But anyway, that was a long-winded way of saying, no, we don't see colony collapse disorder per se in other bee species outside of honeybees.
Yeah, I don't know if this tracks with where the research, I guess, is headed, but at least in the sources of news that I tend to follow, it seems like all of the colony collapse disorders that were really common, the stories about colony collapse disorders from a few years ago, excuse me, have been replaced by people saying, okay, back off on the backyard beekeeping a little bit because the native bees they need nectar too, right?
Yeah, there's been a big shift that's happened in the last, I'd say especially the last few years, that for a long time, honeybees were kept and revered, and they are, like I said, they are fun to keep and they're fun to work with. I'm definitely allergic to them now, but before I had fun with them. But but there's no free lunch. You can't put something somewhere new and spread it all over and have feral hives, budding off of managed hives. You can't have a situation like that and not have a consequence that impacts the things that are native to an area. You just can't. And so they're a part of the system now, but and I don't think we'll ever not have honeybees in this country, but I do think we need to regulate them more and spread more awareness that it's not just, honey and fun stuff, that there are consequences too that people need to think about, like with everything,
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so we had maybe some more basic kind of bee biology questions. We had a question about what are some of the common bee predators in the desert?
I know there are some birds that predate upon bees. You also find these certain types of spiders. I'm blanking on the name of them, that they'll sit and wait on flowers, and then they'll get the bee when it comes to the flower. Those are two of the main ones that I know of. But I would say bee predation upon bees is still a pretty understudied area of bee research. We have another professor in our department who works on that though. So she works on, she collects fecal matter from birds and other things, and then she can sequence the DNA in there to figure out what things have been feeding on. And so it's a fun way. I think it's fun. I think she has fun with it, to try to understand what things they're eating. So it's this kind of neat window into diet, and I'm sure in her studies she's learning more about bee predation by birds and other things.
I'll say that at least in some cases, when the lizards are lucky enough to find a rock that gets up close to where the flowers are, they really like bees. They often see tiny lizards scat full of bee heads. When you
yeah, there's a famous bumblebee study that happened. It was in Big Sur, and someone put bumblebee colonies out, and it was this great, really controlled study, and some lizards came and took out some enormous percentage of bees, and they would just sit at the entrance to the colony and just snap.
Yep. And then do you know a couple of specific species associations? Do you know of any specific associations with desert willow or with honey mesquite?
I have a desert willow in my yard that's flowering now, and I actually haven't seen a lot of things visit it. I've seen honeybees go to it, and I've seen I think I've seen a Carpenter bee visit it, but it's not like the Palo Verde where they're just like all over it. So unfortunately I don't have a lot of information about that, but maybe as mine continues to grow, I'll have more information about that.
Yeah, I'll make the same observation. Mine is also flowering and doesn't get a lot of bee activity.
Oh, someone wrote that they have a desert willow and the Carpenters love it. So maybe mine just needs more flowers. It's pretty young.
Let's see. And then you talked a little bit about sort of the bee, or you mentioned sort of in reference to the sort of structure, the societal structure, I guess, of the bee hives. So can you talk a little bit maybe about how the queen relates to the rest of the female bees, relate to the males and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So the queen is the mom who has produced the workers. So the workers in the nest are female, and they are produced from fertilized eggs. So the queen mated at some point. She stores sperm in a special structure that she has. And then she lays eggs in the colony. And if she fertilizes those eggs, and she can fertilize or not fertilize, if she fertilizes them, they develop into females and they become workers, or they can become new queens. This is sort of the general way it works in social bees. And then the males are actually unfertilized eggs. So the queen can lay an egg that's not fertilized, and it develops into a male. And for those of you that are into genetics and stuff, the males are haploid, so they are unfertilized. They have only one copy of the genome, and the females are diploid. So it's kind of this neat system. And then in honeybees, at least, when a female So a fertilized egg will become a female. When the egg develops into a larva, if the larva is fed a substance called royal jelly, and no other substance, essentially, then it can develop into a queen. That's why it's called royal jelly. Whereas workers are female larvae that have been fed a more mixed diet. And so in bumblebees, we don't know what they don't have royal jelly, so we don't know what it is that turns a female larva into a queen or a worker. That's something my lab's really interested in, but it's hard to figure out. It looks like there's something about the diet of the larva as well, but they don't have this sort of special substance like royal jelly. And then the males in social insect colonies, they don't do a lot of work. They basically emerge in the colony and leave. That's it. Whereas the female worker bees, they stay in the nest and help the queen, their mom, rear more offspring. So that's the basic kind of, in a nutshell, the social biology of a bees, and that some of those basic details you see in the bumblebees, the honeybees, and many of the other social bee lineages.
Great. Okay, I think we're pretty much running up against our time. So I want to thank you again for sharing your knowledge with us and spending the time and talking about desert bees. Can you mentioned you were going to share there's some more answers or questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, but if maybe folks have questions, they can either email you or contact you.
Sure, I'll type my email in the chat right now. And
great.
I'm happy to answer.
And definitely encourage folks to check out a lot of the, Maggie's been sharing a lot of the links that you've been mentioning in the chat. And if you want to, we're getting a lot of thank yous and fantastic presentations, and everybody really enjoyed the talk. But anyway, folks, if you enjoyed the talk, make sure you check out those links and especially look at that inclusivity scholarship. That looks pretty like an important thing to support. And with that, we will say goodnight to everyone and encourage you to check out our next Wild Coachella lecture, which will be in October, and we'll be talking about or learning about the effect of noise pollution and light pollution on birds in urban areas, or maybe urban wildland interface areas. So that'll be a really interesting talk. And we also have the Wild and Scenic Film Festival coming up. So watch out in your email for those upcoming events. And good night, stay safe, and plant some native plants for bees.
Yeah. And thanks for having me. It's always fun.